Hi, everyone. Can someone tell me if you can hear me? Someone in the chat, is there sound? Yay, thank you. Okay, wow. Lots of people. Okay, this is going to be a little bit of a fast whirlwind to teach these things in time. So, and we have a very diverse audience here, so I'm going to just blow through a whole bunch of topics. The first half is going to be pretty, well, fairly normal. And then we're going to jump off the cliff for the second half for the really crazy part. So this is my second live. Welcome, everyone. And let's see if I can get this started. Hang on just 1 second. I'm going to pull up my presentation. If you haven't, it would be great if you introduce yourself in the chat. Yay, I did it. Okay, so this is called optimizing movement. Oh yeah, one more thing. I won't be checking the chat until it's time for Q&A after this presentation. And even then, I'll only be looking at it after I stop and we start Q&A. So feel free to make full use of the chat. Just know that I probably won't see it. So you could be literally typing, you know, their curtain is on fire behind you, and I'll just keep talking, I won't know. So today's goal is really to help give you a perspective. And for a few of you, this won't be a huge stretch, just a little stretch. But for a lot of you, including our students, this really might push you a little bit. But it's just about a perspective from science, but maybe not the science that you might be thinking of. So again, part one, we're going to start now with some things that are fairly normal if we're going to talk about optimizing movement. So before we can even think about optimizing movement, I just want to make sure that I've said none of this matters if we're not optimizing for adaptation. So the whole point of doing any activities that we're doing is to cause an adaptation, whether it's changes in the tissues, tissue remodeling, whatever it is, neuroplasticity. We want the body, when it's asleep, to be able to make the changes that we have provoked from our activities. So even though I don't think I need to tell you all this, but it is so important, and this is the low-hanging fruit for movement optimization. So a whole bunch of people, yeah, their sleep is kind of not quite great. Yeah, maybe they have a little bit too much chronic stress. And remember, stress is good, chronic stress is not. And then nutrition and hydration. So, or if someone you're coaching, I can't emphasize enough how important those things are, because they make all the difference as to whether any of this is actually going to have much of a good effect. Okay, so now I've said that. Now, the a little bit less obvious, but still in the realm of normal. Well, I say normal in that what I'm going to talk about now are just 4 things that are very well supported in motor research. In fact, really, really, really well supported. And not just motor research, but learning in general. But they are 4 things that we still aren't doing in most traditional training and education and coaching and rehabilitation. So you may already be familiar with one or all of these. And again, these 4 things I'm going to talk about, I could do easily a 2-hour live on just one of these 4. And I'm just going to say a few things on each one before we move to the big stuff. So you can let me know later in the comments on the video if there's one of these topics that you would like to see me do a whole thing on. So I'm not going to do these little topics justice. So this is on optimizing practice, things that you can do during a practice session, or how you should be thinking about practice from the perspective of what we're seeing in the research. First one is whole versus part. I'll talk about each one for just a second. Versus blocked, representative practice, and external focus of attention. So after I talk about these, each one just for a moment, then we're going to start to look at the clue to where this is going. And that clue is about what these four things have in common. But first, let's just run through each one just very briefly. And again, most of you are probably familiar with these. And they're also very easy to Google and very easy to get more information on. And I will show you a couple books too. So whole versus part, this just means that we try not to break a skill up into its components or subcomponents. So even though it's been very, very, very common to isolate, decompose, perfect something, or get what we thought was muscle memory at some piece of it, and then we would put all the pieces back together. And for a whole bunch of reasons that we can't talk about here, excuse me, they don't go back together. The pieces don't go back together. And even when they look like they've gone back together, they are very fragile because it was so disconnected from the purpose of those individual movements. And again, you'll see later in this presentation why this didn't actually behave the way that we thought it would. So we don't want to do successive approximation of these sub-skills and then hope to put them back together. Instead, we can take the whole skill, but simplify it, make it slower, use easier equipment, make it a little bit less complex, but it's still the thing. Okay. The next one is random versus blocked. And you've probably all heard about this, maybe for cognitive skills. And it also might be called masked versus random versus spaced versus, there's all sorts of terminology around the way that we try to acquire information. And random, which is not actually random, I'll talk about that in a second, is better overall than blocked practice. And blocked practice just means where you focus on one thing for a certain period of time and you work on that. And then you move to the next thing and you work on that. So this is both within one session and maybe within, a period of weeks, but mostly we're talking about what happens in one practice session. So you're focusing on this and you work on it and you work on it, you have some objective, you get a result, and then you move to the next thing. That would be blocked practice. So we don't want that. We actually want random, although random isn't really just random. In fact, it's usually well designed when you try to use this principle. It's more like interleaved, where you're switching back and forth, you're pulling in a whole bunch of different things, and then alternating instead of just focus on this one and then focus on this one and then focus on this one. And you probably already know that that can feel very disruptive and chaotic. And yeah, that's part of the point. That's part of why it works. But pretty sure by now that at least a few of you are thinking, yeah, but that can't possibly work because it's too frustrating or it's too chaotic or we don't see the results we get when we just stop and focus on something. I'll get there. Now, representative, which is really crucial, regardless of your sport and regardless if we're talking about humans or horses, although it's a little interesting for horses because we really value the sport of preparing them for life. Like their sport is just their real life. then yeah, we have their particular discipline they might be competing in or what we like to do, but we're preparing them for their real life. And even if you're training athletes, of course, there is that cliche, the um, the elite athlete gets out of his car, sprains his ankle on his way to the track, right? So we still want to prepare even our elite athletes, sometimes especially our elite athletes, because they may have become so specialized for real life. But representative just means the degree to which the practice, common example of not doing that, but it's really common, right? Practicing going around the cones with the ball, sort of agility footwork. These are the most easy to, I guess I'll say, attack because they're so obvious. And the two big problems, well, among other things, is the size and shape of the cone and that the cones don't move. They just sit there. So this is not in any way representative if someone is trying to prepare themselves to be better at, for example, playing football or whatever it is. But this is what people have always thought, and what I thought too for a long time. But all that fast, agile footwork, right? Look at the skill. And that's what we used to think. But all of that cone work makes you better at mostly cone work. Now, it can be a great conditioning exercise, but we should never, ever think of these as agility. And in fact, the definition of agility in most common sport terms now has been updated to include unpredictable stimulus response, right? It's not agile if you're navigating something that's not dynamically fixed and moving that you don't have to react to. So, and that's just one of the things that's an issue, but there are also other problems with that, with using things like the cones, and I'll talk about that. So the biggest problem is that, and we've known this for a long time, despite how we trained, that learning of almost anything is very specific. And when you're talking about adaptation, remodeling tissues, neural circuitry, very, very, very specific to that activity. And so the real problem is that we are always looking for transfer. Will this activity transfer, first of all, to the skill or to the performance in sport that we most care about? But for me personally, it's, will this transfer to anything other than this thing? So it's not just that we're worried about, well, maybe you're just wasting time. Sometimes that is the issue, where we're saying, yeah, that activity is fun, it's not hurting you, but you could be spending that time doing something that actually is improving agility or balance or strength or whatever it is, instead of this thing that actually only trains that thing. But there is a bigger problem, which is that some activities, although sometimes it's hard to know which ones, have a negative transfer, where that practice activity, learning that thing, actually then interferes with and makes it harder at the real thing. So for example, when you think of cones, they're low and they don't move and they don't look anything like humans. Now, most people say, well, yeah, but obviously when the player gets out there, he knows that's a human, right? And it's different. But we have subconsciously trained, or we should say our movement system has subconsciously acquired and attuned to sensory information about the activity that not only isn't going to be present in the real activity, but interferes with it. And the really sort of big, most obvious example is, the kids soccer or football, as you call it, coach who has his kids doing these drills. And then as soon as they go play, he's yelling at them to get their head up, to look up. But they've been training focused on the ground. And there are so many things that we don't know what the athlete is truly attuning to. And because we can't know for certain, even though these things now are being studied, the more representative, the better. But it certainly doesn't mean everything always has to look exactly like the thing. But closer is better. And here's another example that I think a lot of people find disturbing, which is in a long-term study of people learning to balance, and these were healthy people. At the end of the 3 months, they were better at slackline for sure, but it did not show any really useful increase in their balance in other activities, including standing on one leg. So it didn't improve their balance, it improved their slackline balance. So we have to think about specificity and transfer. So again, people will think, well, that makes no sense. They're really good at balance. No, they're good at balancing on a slackline. And that's the study right there, 3 months of slackline training. Here's another one. It's a shorter term one. Training improves task specific, but not general balance in female handball players. And there's a meta review. And it doesn't say it absolutely won't improve other forms of balance. It says that for the most part, they have not been able to find evidence that it actually does. So it's much better to default to thinking these things don't transfer the way we hoped. And same with agility. So when we look at something like this, we can think, well, what if this is a practice activity? What is that transferring to? Now, this one's a little bit more interesting because this by itself, well, if you don't look at the horse's mouth, if you just look at the legs, beautiful movement, right? I mean, I'm all about the frontal plane, right? So we've got some adduction and abduction. This is a very athletic movement. Looks great. But if this is being trained in a classical approach, and I mean classical dressage, then there is only one correct way for the horse to execute that movement. And the horse is being trained to only execute the movement in that one ideal way. And of course, we don't get biomechanic ideals in the real world. So this is what we're preparing the horse for. And when we have these optimized practice activities, they're not representative of any of the things the horse will do in his life, right? Obviously, just the sensory information, right? The footing, the ground he's on, what's the environment like? The horse might be running around crazy in the pasture at night, right? In the dark. We have to think about what will and won't transfer. And we already know that training only for correctness, certainly we've learned this the hard way in the human world, doesn't transfer well to other activities and other movements, even closely related movements, if we keep converging. So we can look at the horse and say, yeah, but look how fit he is. He's got these muscles. He clearly can do these things. But what we're seeing is that he can do these things he's been trained to do. And we've slowly taken away the things that he can't. And muscle development alone in no way tells us that whatever that development is going to be usable, accessible in any meaningful way to other skillful movements. And I think we all intuitively know that about when we look at people who, for example, are just bodybuilders. But if you get them in the right position, you can just push them over. So it really just depends on if that is their sole goal, is to develop muscles for the aesthetics of it, or maybe to be strong on that one exercise. That's great. Doesn't transfer, or doesn't transfer well. So spoiler alert, training only for correct causes a fragile horse. So we train for the other 23 hours because the sport is life to us, but we think it should be for anybody working with movement. Because again, it's not going to help you or your athletes if they aren't prepared for the real world, where I think it was Gray Cook that said, sooner or later, gravity will take you there. Or Dr. Andrea Ospina, who said you always regret not training the position in which you were injured. So the last one of these four is external versus internal focus. To me, this one is so significant, the easiest one to change in anyone's practice activities, and have the most immediate potential impact. And the students or the learners or the athletes might not even know that you've done anything different. So, of course, we want an external focus of attention. And again, I'll show you a book about it, but since I can't really say much about this, it really, the simple summary is an internal focus is a focus on the body part. What is the body part doing? An external focus is focusing on something, anything other than the body. And typically it's focusing on a result of the movement. So we don't want to be giving cues and instructions that talk directly to a body part. So that means we're not going to say things like, bend your knees, especially not bend your knees to 45 degrees or whatever. Left shoulder back, rotate the hip, no piano hands, right? We're not, if we're using this external focus research, we're not going to be telling the body parts what to do. And a lot of times coaches at first will think, how's that possible? I have to tell them what to do because they're not doing it. But there are very easy ways to achieve the same result. Now, later you'll see we train in a way where we don't try to influence the body parts directly at all. But that's usually a much bigger leap for people. So what almost anyone could do right now is just change their practice by just not referring to the body part. Use metaphors, use analogies. This even works. Put a piece of tape on the body part and just instruct them to move the tape somewhere instead of move the arm. Now, it would seem like that couldn't possibly give you better access to movement resources like range of motion and strength and all of that and coordination, but it does. It is that powerful because now the movement system can bring in all of its incredible capability because it knows what the point of the movement is. It doesn't have to care that moving the tape to the ceiling is not really interesting. It knows what the goal is, but simply moving your arm to a certain degree, right? You cognitively know what the goal is, but the movement system doesn't see the point. So, and the research on this is almost certainly the most robust findings in all of motor learning research, in the last 40 years. It's that solid. And yet it's not really used much. There are two books. I'll show you one that has a lot of the research in it, but there's also a brand new book by a coach for coaches of humans, but it's still a great book, even if your athletes are horses. I think it's called The Language of Coaching. And it's just a fantastic book. It talks about the way in which our words can make such an impact. But as its base assumption is all of this research on external versus internal focus and what that means. Okay, is this always the best? I'm going to say, 99% of the time, perhaps. Not 100%, but so close. And there are a few circumstances, like, for example, if your entire sport is about how you move your body part, not because you're moving it to do something else. So some dancers, for example, it might be that, well, your whole job is to just, I don't know, I'm not a dancer, but move your arm in a particular way, right? So if that is your activity, then focusing internally on what that body part is doing, because there is no other goal for that body part. But those are really kind of extremes. And in fact, because people have been so wanting to disprove this, because it's such an uncomfortable thing at first, Later, it's awesome. There have been a lot of studies from people trying to show, well, no, what about this case? Well, what about this case? What if it's a person who's never, ever done this before? And it's the first time they picked up the thing, right? There are all sorts of find the one situation where it might not work as well. That's why this, or that's partly why this research is so robust and wonderful, because there's been so much done. It's not talked about much. Now, where it's going to start to get interesting is, what do these things have in common? There is a common theme in these 4 things. And I've just picked these 4 because they happen to be 4 that I think can make a huge difference. Obviously, there's more to skill acquisition. And we haven't even gotten to the optimizing movement. This is just optimizing kind of the practice activities. This is how living creatures evolved, to do whole movements, not practice them in isolated parts. Things are random, not this big block of time to work on this one thing. Things are representative because we were doing them in the real world with an external focus. So if you think of how, had 1 billion years to get this system really amazingly awesome, but we have not been exploiting what nature does. We've been trying to shut it down. So when you think of cavemen, right, they weren't there trying to work on their technique in this pristine environment and then going out and trying to apply it. And babies. And there's not some seriously magical thing where suddenly the kid hits 4 years old and now we need to start instructing him because his movement system has somehow changed. Their movement system, there are some developmental milestones, but their movement system, it's the one we all have, and of course horses have. Although horses are already born doing this. But these are the things we did. So we did the opposite. Understanding why we did the opposite and why the opposite feels good is part of where we're going, because it's that intuition that led us down the wrong path. Because this is what you'll hear, but everyone knows that works. I mean, that's how we do it. You could name 1 million athletes who trained mostly that way and say, therefore, it works. But does it though? Correlation, causation, all of that. And again, it would be okay if there wasn't possibly not just an opportunity cost, but a potentially more severe cost to the mover in many different ways by not doing this. So again, if it's so wrong, why were we all doing it? Because of premature optimization. It's the deception problem, which you'll learn more about in a minute, of trying to optimize. Because we're thinking always about the short-term results that we see, and we're measuring progress, even if we're just imagining we don't actually necessarily have to write it down or have statistics, but we are measuring progress based on what we see and feel in these short-term experiences. And we don't necessarily see what is the long-term implication of that. So that's the first issue that we're going to start to look at. And that's what looks better in practice is typically not best for long-term retention and transfer. And again, this is both physical and cognitive skills. So that discomfort, that the better ways, the more optimal ways to practice, that discomfort, it's uglier. You don't feel as successful at the end because you're not. You don't make as much progress. So it feels very inefficient, uncomfortable, doesn't feel good. Unless you really understand and you trust it, and then it feels amazing. But because that's how we saw it, right? We were making very logical conclusions. This is clearly not as good. I can see the results. I could do an A/B test myself and see this form of practice worked really well. When I tried that for a week, not so much. But we weren't seeing the long-term implications, and those implications go much further than we could have ever imagined. So premature optimization, what looks best in practice, isn't necessarily what's best for long-term retention and transfer. Progress results lie. They lie to us, they wrong at all. In fact, it might be the only one that we can use. So now we're going to jump off the cliff, but we'll still start gently on this cliff dive. So now we're going to get to the stranger things. So the problem with optimizing movement as a concept and a practice is the very idea of optimizing movement. So that's not very helpful, right? So optimization is about converging, trying to get closer and closer to whatever the ideal template is for particular movements. Typically, that's a biomechanics template, and then we've adjusted it for the individual. There are some sports where they'll call it the champions model, which is the ideal template is the one that the best person in the world, well, he does it that way. So not recognizing that anyone who's incredibly skillful does not perform the same way every time. And we'll look at that. So nature doesn't find an optimal solution. It finds a whole bunch, excuse me, of high quality but diverse solutions to the very same movement problems, right? It's not just that the movement toolkit says, all right, you can do this, you can climb, you can jump, you can run, you can throw, right? You've got all of it, which is kind of sometimes a more functional movement approach. Nature is saying, no, I want you to be able to have this big range of solutions for every single movement. But they're not just random. So this is, Nikolai Bernstein, the hero to many of us, right? A Russian scientist from long ago. It's believed, I don't know if this is accurate, but it's believed that he coined the term biomechanics. But he was arguably kind of the father of what we might think of as this modern study of movement. And he did these, very primitive, but these high-tech at the time motion capture studies. I think they called it a cyclograph. And one of the first studies, and this is probably the example that most of you are familiar with, is with expert blacksmiths. And I mean expert, right? It's important that we're talking about experts. And what an expert means in most of these contexts of skill acquisition is that they have very reliable, consistent outcome of a movement. But we're not saying anything about how they got there, both how they developed it, but also how they actually struck that target. So in the case of the blacksmiths, they hit that hammer, excuse me, in the right spot on the anvil or whatever it was, every single time. Astonishing consistency. But this shows the path they took to getting there. Every repetition was a different ratio of, their coordination to do it. Every single repetition of the exact same movement that produced the exact same result. So he coined this term in this science, which is repetition without repetition. It's that every single rep is different. And so there must be a reason for that, right? Now, just a little side, because I always do this. Just know that most sport horse injuries are considered cumulative microtrauma, repetitive stress, right? Not the one catastrophic injury from some bad, incident, right? So people often say, my horse was in turnout and a tendon just blew, right? But it didn't blow out of nowhere. Almost certainly, that was just the last moment of what had been building and building and building. And what's important to understand is that there is not evidence that correct biomechanics protects from cumulative microtrauma. Now, too. So nature evolved movement to be divergent. In a moment, we're going to see just how crucial that is with functional variability. Functional variability, that's not the same use of the word functional as in functional movement. So when they use the term functional variability in the science, it means there's a range of variability in which this optimal result, right? The result, not how they move their body to hit the target or get the ball there, whatever. It's within a range that's functional. And especially for human sports, right? There could be ways of moving with variability that change the physics so much, the person will never be able to generate the force to do the thing or whatever. So functional variability is within this range. And nature automatically builds a collection of diverse quality ways to solve the same movement problem. But traditional training is deliberately trying to stop that, trying to shut that down. Now, some of you actually, since most of you are horse people, you may actually be a blacksmith or know farriers who pound steel on anvil. And I've certainly known a lot over the years. And one of them had told me that when he got out of farrier school, they told him, you only have so many strikes of the hammer in your life before you break down. And it is probably pretty easy to look at this and say, yeah, this could be very protective, because if you have many different ways of solving that same problem, you're spreading out the stress. But there's a lot more interesting stuff to it, not just that. So traditional training has been shutting that down, making it more consistent. But here's the thing. We were trying to train, humans and horses for the last 60 years, 50 years, maybe, as if they were smart machines. And we'll take a little detour to look at why that happened. But here's where it's strange, because while we were doing that, more recently, the really smart engineers were looking to train smart machines by studying what living creatures in nature were doing. Because they found out that trying to teach machines the way we train humans makes those machines super fragile. And it's some of the most interesting and awesome stuff. So now we're just going to look at a few little lessons from that world, the world at the very edge of artificial intelligence, robotics, looking at ways to actually learn from nature. And yes, it's a little sad that we have to actually learn from the people teaching machines what we should already know. But here we go. So this was from 2015 in the Nature, the Journal of Nature, which is one of the most respected science journals, on the planet. This was a really shocking one and awesome, because they created this robot, a 6-legged robot, each leg 3 degrees of freedom, that could recover. It could just get back on its feet, no matter what it was encountering. And so they would deliberately harm it. So they would just, drop a brick on its leg. And the robot, which you can't possibly have programmed this in, the robot needed to find a way to adapt to that and recover. So in a minute, we'll come back to the way they did that has lessons for us. Although basically it's just sort of reinforcing what we kind of assumed nature was really doing. But we want to exploit that. And they even use the word instinctive robot recovers from injury fast. Restorative algorithm has the potential to make a variety of machines resilient. And I suggest that you, not now, but when you finish this, I think it's worth this tiny, tiny detour on why did that happen? Most of you were probably not even alive when that happened, when we began going heavily down the path of humans are machines. I was alive when that happened. The cognitive revolution is what it's often been called. And because this was the rise of tech and information theory, in fact, literally in Claude Shannon's information theory, and everything was about, cybernetics and information processing. This is an incredibly influential book from, I think, the early 1960s. And we started using that as a model, as an assumption basis behind cognition and movement. So this had so much of a deep impact. And when I was at university, this was how we learned movement. And, the sensory system takes in information, it processes it because it's just a computer up there. And then the output is a motor program. And that's kind of how we thought of muscle memory, right? We were just building that program, and then the computer would just pick that one off the shelf and run it. So that took us down a very dark path, and it's taken, the ecological psychologists a very long time to say, yeah, we got that wrong. So biomechanics also forgot during this period of time that there's a bio in biomechanics. So here's the guy who gave us all of this amazing insight and research into movement, and we just ignored all of it. In fact, I keep finding people who study biomechanics who've never even heard of him. So that shouldn't be happening. But what we saw, because of the cognitive revolution, we saw anything that was variable as noise in the system, and we wanted to have a much cleaner signal. So from that base assumption of how things worked, we wanted to remove the noise. Noise is that's just making it less efficient, right? We want to remove that. So we were removing the variability that nature had so desperately, over 1 billion years, given us. So there were top leading biomechanists, although I don't know, well, yeah, I do. I know only one in the equine world, but they started to care again. This is a TED Talk that if you haven't seen it, you absolutely should, but not now. I'm almost done. The Importance of Variation in Human Movement by Dr. Nick Stergio. It's a great 17-minute TED Talk, but he runs one of the leading biomechanics labs. And in fact, this biomechanics lab is called the Center for Research in Human Movement Variability. And this is a fantastic book. It's an older book, 2005, about just the research on human movement variability, and it's awesome. So this idea of human movement variability, this is in part of the underpinnings that's used in this ecological dynamics, this constraints-led approach, the nonlinear pedagogy, all these things that we're using now. So the biggest problem is we were training to remove the things that made living creatures adaptable. So variability it's protective of overuse, for example, but it's also really important for recovery. But it goes further than that. So how does nature optimize movement? And what if the movement just is bad, right? So in a traditional approach, we would say, well, if the movement is bad, then we're going to fix it, right? We're going to correct it. Back to something that is either more biomechanically optimal for this particular sport movement, or in the equestrian world, it's often what we will call healthy, but which actually isn't, because that's not the definition of healthy movement any longer, unless you're in that biomechanics, I'm going to call it old school realm. So what would nature do? Answer, how does nature optimize movement? It does it by not trying to optimize a movement. Yes, that's a paradox. But before we can understand that really, and sort of get your brain around what that means and how to use that and how these scientists have used it, we have to think of the movement system from any living creature for what it is in biology, we are complex, dynamic systems following, quote, non-linear rules of nature, not linear. But we have been trying to treat the body and movement as though it were linear, right? Forgetting the bio, using just the mechanics. Well, movement, it's just physics, right? It's just leverage and moment arms and, you know, all of that. So we treated movement like machines, completely missing the point as far as nature is concerned of why we have movement in the first place. So, but people will go, well, I'm sorry, nature sucks, because, you know, if nature was doing that job, just optimizing movement, then we would not be here trying to find out how to optimize movement, because everyone would already be doing optimal movement. But we've been spending all of this time in training and teaching movement by shutting down the things nature needs to do its optimization. So we've been not just not helping, we've been fighting it. But more than that is, of course, the lifestyle, right? Again, a billion years, we didn't evolve for the kinds of lifestyles that we have. So it is true, the movement system absolutely needs help. And, you know, there's the one special case with the horse, but I've talked about this and I'll talk about it in another talk, which is, yeah, the horse, the one thing they didn't evolve to was to carry weight on their spine. So that's the one thing we teach them to do. But we still don't do it by telling them how. We just give them a goal of how to resist what the weight is doing to them and still be able to reorganize and adapt their movement. Now, still haven't answered the question. How does nature do it? And what does it mean to not optimize, to optimize by not optimizing? Well, for me, it started with this paper. And I think this was published in 2011. And the title is Abandoning Objectives, Evolution Through the Search for Novelty Alone. Now, this is where it's going to start to get even weirder. So Dr. Kenneth Stanley and Joel Lehman, they are at the absolute leading edge of artificial intelligence and artificial life research. Kenneth Stanley used to be the head of Uber AI, which, you know, they're making self-driving cars, which is really scary. But he and Dr. Joel Lehman, they created these projects and invented this novelty search, which has now, since 2011, spun off into so many incredible things. In fact, also a variation is what led to that self-correcting robot. They wrote this book, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, The Myth of the Objective. So just bear with me for a moment on this example, because this, if you can, I don't know if I'll do a good job explaining it, because I've never tried to explain this before, but if you can kind of get this, this is kind of the essence of what's happening. Imagine that you have a maze, and you're going to create code, or just think of training, right? And they use the term reinforcement learning because they are using reinforcement learning in artificial intelligence to help the whatever it is that's, well, I'll call it the agent that's trying to learn something, to say, yes, you're on the right track. No, that's not the right track. So you can imagine it getting sort of reinforcement points, you know, plus R for doing the right thing, nothing, no reinforcement for doing the wrong thing, but then it will get sort of punishment if it does absolutely the wrong thing. So imagine that it's trying to get to this goal. Now remember, they don't know what the maze, the configuration maze. So they don't know that the maze looks like this. The agent doesn't know, the software doesn't know, but it has to have some way of knowing what to reinforce. It knows where the goal is up there, but it doesn't know the path to getting there. So it has to make an assumption, and what it assumes is that getting closer to the goal is obviously the best path to reinforce, because again, it doesn't know that it's a maze or what the maze looks like. So it might give 0 points for going sideways, but it's reinforcing the hell out of plus R, moving toward the goal. But it's going to give, whatever it is, however it's training it, negative points or what we might think of as punishment, if it's going away from the goal. Because it only has this one objective, which is get as close as you can to the goal, because that's the only thing it can possibly reinforce, right? Now, this is kind of a metaphor, because you can imagine with any level of complexity, there's no way you're not going to build a system that's just going to randomly keep trying every possibility, right? We did that a long time ago, and they were slow, and it didn't help us do anything interesting. So it was optimized for closer to the goal. And here is the key. And the rest of this talk is just about this, understanding what this means in terms of movement. The steps to X don't look like X. For anything that's interesting, for any movement that we don't absolutely know that there is only this one step, and it's known and it's guaranteed, and that, right? For anything interesting, anything creative, anything that requires any sort of a organization leap, which is most of the movements that we're thinking about, the steps to X don't look like X. But traditionally, we have been reinforcing movements that get closer and closer and closer to X, that look more X-like, or at least look like they're on the way to X. And we're not going to reinforce the things that look the opposite of X, or that are going way the heck out there. So deception is what happens when we are tricked by progress that looks like X, because it looks like we're getting closer to the goal. But the truth might be that we actually need to move in the opposite direction, and no one's going to be rewarding it for going way the hell out there, because we only know because we actually see the maze. But if you don't know that maze, you're never going to think that's promising. So we were trapped in a local optima, which means that we thought this is as good as it gets because it's as close as we can get. So we just get stuck. When you do not know the steps to getting to X, well, then what do you reinforce? I mean, this is all that they could come up with to reinforce. We're going to measure. Are you closer to the objective? Are you closer to the objective? Are you closer to the objective? But with movement, a lot of times we think we know the steps. This is the most amazing thing, that even though so many human athletes and so many horses, so many people are struggling with movements, and yet we still believe it's a very linear path. And we're just tweaking the edges, right? If we get the right equipment, or if we get that right technique, then it will work. But we don't, but we think that we do. So let's say that collected canter is the big goal up there. And we want the horse to get there. Even if we're starting at a pretty basic point, we can still think, but we know the steps. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fluidity in the steps, but we have the training scales, right? And it should be a clue that so many different experts have a different version of steps. So we already know there isn't one true way, but we still assume there are steps and that they can be known, but that we just need to get better at what. And so whenever someone doesn't reach their goal or has trouble, especially in the equestrian world, if it's minus R, people will say, well, your timing isn't right, your feel isn't right, you need to get your own balance right, you need to, all these things. In plus R, traditional positive reinforcement, often people will say, well, you don't have your antecedents right, you don't have your reinforcement schedules, work on that, and you will get this, right? But the thing is, we're in a maze, and we don't know it, because this is how movement works, because we and they are living complex, dynamic, nonlinear systems. There's no way out of that, even if we wish that weren't the case, right? So this is what happens. We're in a maze, but we don't realize it. So we're reinforcing getting closer and closer and closer, and we get stuck because we're never going to reinforce this. Well, some of us will. Some of us will. But the point is, even those of us who do, we still don't know that is the path out of the maze. We still don't see the maze. But we can have reasons to suspect that it's promising. It's interesting. It might not get us to collected canter, but it's worth doing and seeing where it leads, right? So this is the problem, is what we think is true, what's actually true. We're in a maze, we don't know we're in a maze for anything interesting and creative. So then how do we achieve the objectives if we don't know the boundaries of the maze and we can't follow the steps? If that it gives us, premature optimization, we hit a local optima. What does that mean? Well, this is how nature does it. It actually abandons the objective. And that is how some of these algorithms came to do incredible things and make breakthroughs that the artificial intelligence, computer science world had never seen before. They abandoned the objectives. Well, then how the hell do you get there if you don't even have the goal? Oh, this is so mind-blowing. Hang on, we're almost there. So it is a possibility space. I'm going to show you this video. Hopefully, with my bandwidth, you'll be able to see it. This is from the early work that Kenneth O. Stanley and Joel Lehman did with this very simple simulated, robot walker. So I'm going to show it to you, and then I'll explain what was actually happening. So look at these two robots and think about which one looks more robust and which one looks more fragile to you, just in how they move. And then that one fell. Hang on. Let's see if I can get that one to play one more time. No, I can't. So here's what happened. The one that looks fragile, that was trained in the traditional artificial intelligence way, was trained using reinforcement learning. Its goal was to walk and walk further. So it got reinforced the more that it walked. So it had to teach itself how to walk so that it could walk. The one on the right was reinforced for novelty. It was never reinforced for walking. In fact, it never had a goal of walking. It was never told to walk. That wasn't part of its goal. But it's walking, like a mofo. It's just moving, right? While the other one is like this. But the other one was trained to walk, and this one, nobody even asked it to walk. So how did it end up walking? Well, of course, I'm so much oversimplifying it, but they used novelty search, which in part meant that the robot, it wasn't random. The robot was there was randomness in it, more for the geeks, stochastic exploration or something. The robot was reinforced for something, but it was reinforced for novelty. So it had to keep track of what it had already done and make sure that it was doing something that it hadn't done. So for example, so why is it walking so robustly? Well, so first, eventually it's going to run out of stuff to do. And the only way it can explore further, which it's going to need to do to go to new places to get more reinforcement. Example, no one would have thought to reinforce the other robot if it threw itself on the ground and started kicking its legs, right? That would have been not something that would be reinforced because it's definitely moving in the wrong direction. But if it's a maze, right, then we don't know. And so, for example, if the mofo robot, the novelty search robot, threw itself on the ground, kicked its legs, it could have been learning about oscillation which was a really important component to walking. So it was building this robust toolkit by continuing to explore. It was diverging instead of converging, and yet it ended up as a better walker. So the steps to X don't look like X. And again, these examples are, well, these are actually real examples, but the maze, you know, even though that was a real thing too, but think of that as just a metaphor. We don't have to think about it as the literal maze, but it's that idea that you can't know until you arrive at something amazing, which would be the steps to get there. You can see, and this is the problem, you can see when you look back. So this is where we get experts who all have different opinions of things, because the expert will look back at how they got there and assume, well, I did this and this and this and this and this, therefore those are the steps. When it could have had nothing to do with that. It could have had everything to do with something they're not even aware they did or do. We don't know. And there is a lot of research on perceptual and implicit learning, but we won't go there. So novelty search helps get around the problem of deception because it's not trying to work toward that goal. So the steps to X don't look like X. I'm going to jump ahead here for a second. The way they did the recovery in this robot, well, and again, I'm really oversimplifying. And even though I worked in artificial intelligence, it was a long time ago, and those were simpler algorithms that failed, by the way, which is part of why that version of AI just sort of died. But now what they're doing is shocking to me. But so I don't understand a whole lot of how it works, but I understand some of it. So they had this robot first explore the search space. And by space, I don't necessarily mean the physical space, although that's part of it. It's exploring the space of possible ways that it can move and things that it can do. And so as it's exploring, and it's doing a form of novelty search, but it's way more interesting than that, it's making a sort of internal map of all the possible ways that it can do things and that it can move. Then, because it has that, it doesn't have this is the one optimal solution. It will say, I have many possible solutions to this. So then if they throw a brick that lands on one of the legs, or they did all kinds of, they basically tortured it. The robot would amazingly figure out how to adapt and still move. And in some cases move almost as fast and as well as it did before, even though now it's got one leg that's not even working and it's possibly getting in the way, but it figures out how to adapt. But the way that it does it, the way that it actually uses the diversity of its toolkit, it's not as simple as, well, now I can't do that one, but I have 3 tools for this, so now I'll just take the next tool. If it's suddenly a leg is gone, it can't just pick the next best thing, which is what traditional training often would do. It needs to look possibly way out here to something it couldn't even have imagined, or that we couldn't have imagined. So it has to explore from tools that are really far away. And the example they give is, if you sprained your ankle on the trail, right, you might try to put your weight on it and do just a walk, but a different walk, but still, you're still walking, but with a limp. And if you find out you can't, you might end up hopping on one leg all the way back. So hopping would be pretty far away from walking in a additional space. If you were trying to program, for example, something that could do that. Robot, what does that have to do with horses? Because that's where they looked. Well, not horses, but living creatures. They looked at how living creatures are so adaptable. How do they do it? It seemed miraculous. And yet we don't appreciate adaptability. Instead, I think this was Franz Bosch who made this amazing quote, which is, We want adaptable athletes, not adapted athletes. But what we're training is athletes who adapt to what we've trained them to do, instead of athletes that in real time, all the time, stay adaptable. We've been removing that capability, and that is how nature optimizes. So we have to turn on their novelty search by supporting that in our training. And there are, of course, lots of ways to do it. But to think nonlinear. So for example, I say the steps to X don't look like X. And by the way, we'll probably be done in 2 minutes. The steps to canter might include chasing a piece of bubble wrap. Now, I laugh about that, but that's very close to how Vavi actually developed canter. Stiff, pacey 5-gaiter could not canter in a 20 meter by 40 meter small dressage court. And if you know 5-gaiters, right, he literally could not canter in that space. He could canter in a big 200-meter track or a giant arena, could not canter in a 20 by 40 dressage court. But within probably 3 days after he finally got the whole chasing the bag, the giant cat toy, he could canter, not just canter in the arena though, he could canter an 8-meter circle as if it was almost effortless. So that's an example of nonlinear, but it wasn't like me and all my creative wisdom thought, I think I can get to canter by giving him this giant cat toy to play with, right? You only know, looking back, what worked. And it only worked in that moment for that horse, for his context, and all the things we can't possibly know, because nature's had 1 billion years. It knows way more than we do, if we help it. The steps to straightness don't look like straightness. And a lot of you have heard us talk about this, that, in a traditional dressage approach, we would work on straightness by, the horse is crooked, he's got one shoulder over here and this leg is out there, by slowly trying to help him build, to take more weight on that leg, to get that shoulder in. Again, we're making all kinds of assumptions that we now believe are not accurate, right? That it's a weakness problem and a suppling problem, but there's lots of evidence that that's not the case. But we're still trying to fix it by the steps to X, the steps to straightness look like getting a little straighter, a little straighter, a little straighter, a little bit at a time. And we can get something that might look like straightness, but we are likely to get so much of a performance problem even when we get to straightness. So we, of course, are going to train it almost the opposite, because a lot of times, if you look at movement science, the path to straightness isn't to correct crookedness. It's often to make the crookedness worse, intentionally. So the steps to X don't look like X, right? That would be something that would be, well, there's no way making it worse. How can we possibly reinforce that? But we're in a maze, right? So things like straightness training, if we're using an approach that goes piece by piece by piece, that's deceptive. And we hit that local optima. And this is what happens, right? People go, well, the horse is finally straight, but they're still missing so many things. We want all the things all at the same time, or, roughly. We want that mofo walker, right? Who we didn't teach to walk, but it's just there. So, of course, people will always say, so you just let them move randomly? No, because novelty search is not random. The very idea of novelty means don't just keep randomly rolling the dice, right? It would be as if you have to roll dice, but each time it's different from what you rolled before. It doesn't mean that we don't doing random things and that we don't ever converge on certain things, but we converge on patterns. We converge on, here's a collection of tools. And if you look at the adaptable self-correcting robot, right? The part of the name of the algorithm was diversity. That's what we're looking for. A collection of high quality solutions, a diverse collection to the same movement problems. That's really powered by repetition without repetition. So nature has had a billion years to get better at this than we could to optimize for adaptability. And we're so used to saying survival of the fittest, but nature is about survival of the ones who were most adaptable. So adaptability is just baked into all of our DNA, and our movement system just had a long time, way longer than our little prefrontal cortex that thinks it knows everything. The movement system, which we share, of course, with the other mammals, is incredible. So nature doesn't optimize for ideal biomechanics. It has no concept of what is correct. It does have a concept of healthy. And we see that in natural variability. But of course, the horses are not in a lifestyle, and they're not moving in the ways that we, because we're going to ask them to do sport that they didn't evolve for. So it's not that we don't need to give them help. It's what kind of help. And for me, I have a much more minimalist approach, that it's about being an ally with nature, exploiting what nature already does. And it just blew my mind that the way that we can help get there is by looking at the way they're teaching robots. But they're the ones who had to study it with an appreciation of nature, because they ran into the limitations of mechanics. And these are the smartest people on the planet. So anyway, that's I don't know if this was all completely sounded crazy or not. But yeah, I will do Q&A now. If anyone's still here. And okay. So to do Q&A, this is a little tricky. I'm going to, okay. So now what you need to do is just write the word question or a big Q and then your question. Because if it doesn't say question or Q, I might not see it. Reading chat text is hard for me. But I can see someone said, will this be available to watch later? I think so. I mean, YouTube will automatically, I think, post it, or I will, if I don't screw up, I will post it. Unless I unless I watch it again and realize that it's too strange. But yeah, probably. And thank you guys. That was, I promised that I would be doing a shorter one, and then I didn't. I did a longer one. Sorry. So I don't see any questions. Remember, any question you can imagine is fine. Oh. Okay, sorry. Hopefully that's better. Oh, yay, thank you for asking a question. Is that, I don't know how to pronounce your name, Jacqueline. Okay, so how do you do this under saddle? Well, there's no difference. I mean, we don't make a distinction. Under saddle is just the horse moving, but carrying a weight on his back. So for us, under saddle is just exercise physiology. And when you get to exercise physiology, you're in a great place to be. So we would develop everything, all the movements we might do under saddle. The horse first needs to own them and discover them on the ground. Now, sometimes that helps when there's weight on their back, because some of it is about the horse learning what it feels like to actually resist that weight. So, but we don't ride them unless they can already do that. But that sometimes doesn't take very long at all. Now, it would for more and more physically challenging movements because they in exercise physiology land, they would still have to develop tissue capacities and to actually do, longer, harder, bigger movements. Like Dramer doesn't have natural suspension at all. For him, his big up trot is super effortful. So that he figured out how to organize the movement from movement exploration, but it was some time before he could do more of it, and then some time before he could do it with weight. But yeah, we don't treat it any differently because it's just another movement puzzle for the horse to solve. So, okay, somebody mentioned treasure hunting. Yeah, you may have seen for the last, I don't know, year and a half, some of us have been using hashtag treasure hunters, hashtag stepping stones. So if you happen to read this book, you'll find out where that came from. Okay, with that principle, is it possible to measure progress? Okay, that's a fantastic question. Um, so so it's interesting. So if you're in a sort of pure novelty search mode, then and this is something I'm not going to do it justice, but this is something that they actually talk about, because that's the most natural question, and because it can apply to so many different domains. So if it's pure novelty, then you're going to measure progress by how many unique things are you able to do? How big is your toolkit? But when people say, well, if you don't have an objective, if you abandon the objective, then why do you do anything at all? Aren't you just wandering around? Well, no, because this is their take on it, and I think this works really well. You're looking for interestingness, but interestingness is our own intuition. We're evaluating that, that's interesting. So we're sort of measuring progress in the sense of, did we get to a new interesting thing? And then can we explore that interesting thing? And it's up to us to say, that's interesting. We don't know that interesting thing is the thing that's going to get us over here. And, it's almost impossible for us to not have these secret objectives, even if we're trying not to. But to me, I think for me, for quite some time, it's been, I do have an objective and I can sort of measure progress, but it's more about, well, for those of you who are in the pain science course, you're looking at the horse's cortical map, for example. Does the horse now have his complete range of motion back? Can the horse do all the movements that he might need to do? Because that's something we are going to try to focus on, because otherwise he's not going to be, there's no point in doing a lot of exploration if he's missing a bunch of ways to actually do things. But we get those things back through exploration. It's just that as far as a measurement, I'm always looking, how's his movement map? And because I want to know, what does the nervous system think the horse is capable of doing? Because that's going to determine the horse's motivation, the horse's potential pain level, how much energy a movement takes, whether the horse is going to be resistant. So that is something I do measure. But after that, like we'll say, well, we're looking for the horse to show something fancy. You are willing to not be so picky about exactly what the amazing thing is. But then we can use that as a launching point for maybe something more specific we do want. So that's why we say, if this horse isn't showing any fancy movements, or he's just not motivated, or whatever, right? He doesn't show off. We might say what we're first doing is just trying to get the horse to want on his own with us to show off, really show off, and do something fancy. And we'll say, every horse will find his own version of fancy. So for a lot of horses, and it will change, right? It can be that they find that big fancy trot that you might see horses do, in the pasture when they're showing off. Or for some, it's this big upright canter that looks really fierce. They like that's very self-rewarding at some point, whatever it is. So we'll take that. We'll go, oh, that's great. Okay, horse, that's interesting. Let's go with that. And then we might find ways to explore that. And at some point, that the horse on his own, but we can help nudge that with constraints, not restraints, but the constraints-led approach. We change the environment, we change the task, and the horse will then start to explore that in other ways and then find another stepping stone that we would never have been able to see in advance. But suddenly now something else is there. And suddenly we have this thing over here. And then we might explore that. And in fact, the only time that it gets a little difficult is when there's something really specific you want. Now, if the horse is not resisting anything and you can ask him for the things that you want, this is where it's perfectly okay to cue those things, those movements, exact movements, when you really need them, right? We wouldn't train that way, except if we wanted to put one of those solutions on a cue because we're going to do a competition or something. That's fine. So what we're talking about is, again, when the steps are not known. If you already know the horse does shoulder in, just a cue shoulder in, right? It's what happens when the horse is resisting it, doesn't do it, it doesn't seem to know how, all of that. Where we want to do that successive approximation, and that's where we get into that deception trap. So, and people said they want to see videos of how the horse. There's a lot on Instagram. My Instagram account, the Panther Flows. My actual, website is Panther Flow, but on Instagram, someone already had that, so it's Panther Flows. But there's so much video there. The puppy is great. Okay, let me try to. Is there something like that exercise program for humans? There are, but most of what I see are courses from physiotherapists for physiotherapists. There's a great book, though, by Todd Hargrove, Playing with Movement. And there are some other people who use these principles. He's my favorite. But most of the ones I know of, they're doing it for other movement professionals, not for, they're sort of training the trainers, not the clients themselves. But okay, Panther Walk is great to explore range of motion on the forehand. How can the horse evolve more ROM on the hind end? Well, I know that I can't say that it's wrong to do this, but I don't like this idea. I'm going to try to find anything else of using the target to get the horse to reach forward with his hind legs. Technically, right? You're not telling the horse how, but what we want is for the horse to discover why he needs to use his hind end in different ways. So by adding a lot more challenge and a lot more variability to Panther Walk, that's usually our easiest path to getting there. But also, you can get a lot of range of motion by for example, adduction and abduction, right? You're going to get that through some sort of leg yield where you're running along the fence line and you're holding a target, or maybe for people who don't do clicker, you're just holding a tub of food. If you're willing to do this, it's not always a good idea, but it's what I do. Running along the fence line, you're holding the food. The horse is keeping track of you, and you speed up. You're going to get not just if the horse starts to speed up because he really wants to keep track of you, you're going to get leg yield. If you play with your speed, you're going to get shoulder. You're going to get all this, and you're going to get a lot of range of motion because you've given the horse a movement challenge where he just automatically does it, right? The changed my mind game where you're just going along this way, and then all of a sudden, oh, changed my mind, and you turn and go the other direction. And then the horse has to figure out how to catch up with you. You get all kinds of cool things. So there's lots of great fun examples, but usually just more challenges in Panther Walk. And that usually means maybe a slope, which is my favorite, even if it's just a tiny short slope with a bend, a more extreme bend. And again, we don't ask for the bend. We get it by giving the horse maybe the target to look at. So he doesn't have a choice because maybe there's a line there. He has to go straight, but he has to keep track of this thing. So Panther Walk with the bend, Panther Walk in a really small space. So if the horse is okay with that, right? Panther Walk in a stall. They have no choice, right? There are things where they have to organize their movements differently. And also it may be the Panther Walk alone, if you kind of max out where you don't get much more variability, so then you're kind of stuck, right? You might be in a local optima of Panther Walk. So just don't worry about Panther Walk. Keep the variability of it. Do it when you want, right? But just work on other things. Just do other stuff. Because it might be, that throwing the foam mat, right, is the thing that suddenly turns on the horse going, oh, wow, I can do so much more with these hind legs. But always, 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 in keeping with this, nature can solve all these things for us. The horse's movement system needs a reason to do the things. So, which I think is the problem with so much movement training of horses. The horse's movement system had no idea. Why do I have to do that? So we're in a fight with the horse's brain who's saying, don't do this bad idea. It's risky or it's a terrible use of resources, right? We need the nervous system to go, oh, hell yeah, this is the best way to do that. So it's giving them a movement reason. Sometimes that's speed and change of direction is just that will do it. Or if the horse doesn't tend to carry and needs more carrying with the hind legs, like the hind legs are too much pushing, then we need to give them a reason to carry. And so that's where things like the little downhill slopes with the bend or sideways on a slope, they're going to have to. They will have no choice because if they push with that wrong leg, they're going to fall over. So brains don't like that. They will organize themselves. And I've showed pictures and video of this. When you see a horse stand on 3 legs and scratch behind his ear with the hind leg, that is extraordinary range of motion. That most people, if you showed someone that you had trained that, they would think that was beyond cruel or impossible. Right? But it's totally not. Nature's like, oh, I got this. Because there's a puzzle to solve and no constraints on the horse. Or I should say no restraints on the horse. Nothing is there to stop the horse from organizing every part of his body to do that. So we are trying to take advantage of those aspects of nature. Is this somewhat influenced by perception? It's totally influenced by perception. Yeah, it's too easy to ask another person to move a body part through language. That's why, a whole bunch of human coaches are trying to move to this form of coaching. I mean, it's way, way further along in the human movement world than the horse world. And I will always laugh at them because they'll say, well, yeah, but how do I influence their movement if I can't just tell them, just move your arm that way, right? And I'll just laugh because I'll go, you guys, imagine that you don't have language to use. That's us. But what's happened, of course, in the horse world is that we compensated by putting gear on and just physically manipulating them into that position. So once you take that away, and again, I'm only talking about taking it away when they are exploring a movement that they either don't know or that they've been resisting, right? You can use reins and do all the stuff as cues. This is about when they need to self-organize because they have trouble doing the thing or they haven't found it yet. It's not going to help us by telling them because now we have actively interfered with nature's way of solving that. And that leads to a big ripple bad effect later. But instead, we just keep modifying the task and the environment. I'm going to show you some books, actually. I forgot I had these. This is the one I talked about that I think is good for people. It's just a great book anyway. Playing with Movement by Todd Hargrove. How to explore the many dimensions of physical health and performance. You can get that on Amazon. Exercise physiology. Oh, the movement system variability book. Only if you are seriously geeky. You don't need this book at all to be able to use these principles. But for those who are interested. But this book, I think, is probably the best one. It's a little geeky, but it's fantastic. The Dynamics of Skill Acquisition and Ecological Dynamics Approach. So again, it's not geared toward horses, but these are the people who have really influenced me. And some of you already know that Marianne Davies, who's I think River Tiger on Instagram, she is right now getting her PhD in applying this to equestrian sports, both the horses and the humans, right? I'm only working with the horses. So, but she's way more badass than I am. And she, works as or did work as a dressage scribe, a judge's scribe. She's very involved in the equestrian community and others. And so she's right now getting her PhD in applying this to equestrian sports. And I think this is her PhD advisor, one of the guys who did this book. So who's one of the original guys. But yeah, this is fantastic. That can really help. How do you reinforce? I'm going to give a really not very satisfying answer unless you already know me and what I do. I'll see if I can kind of make it easy. I do use positive reinforcement for some things because you can't do self-organization you can do a lot with a horse with, for example, negative reinforcement, which I also do use, but you can't do self-organization if the horse is trying to still earn relief from pressure, because that's telling his movement system what you want, not what movement puzzle to solve. And that at first won't seem like it's a big distinction, but it's huge. And they have to have autonomy when they're doing this kind of work. If they're not volunteering for it, if their nervous system feels under threat, well, that's why you get the resistance. That's when you don't get exploration. So for all the things that we need, right? Some people can do it with just playing with the horse and the horse is really interested, right? I don't seem to have that kind of effect on my horses. So I have no problem using positive reinforcement, but I use it really differently with movement than I would for other things, and way off the best practices of, for example, the clicker training world, right? We use it in a completely different way. Which is why it often looks to other people like you're just frustrating the horse. And a lot of times we are, but that's why autonomy is so important. Because if you look back at everything I said in this video, right, well, when you're doing that, that's almost the opposite of what sort of a clicker training approach would normally be, which is the small steps, no errors, right? Everything is clean, no confusion. We want all that other stuff because that's how the nervous system becomes, oh yeah, I got this. We need it for learning. We need it for everything. So Instead, we reinforce the what, but not the how. So we use positive reinforcement to teach the tools of communication so that we can then give the horse these challenges, but we don't reinforce any one solution. In fact, you kind of have to work harder to reinforce differently each time so that you don't accidentally reinforce a particular solution, right? We don't want the horse to move his body by saying, I think this is what she wants. Yeah, this leg goes here, which would be the traditional approach of micro-shaping it. We don't want that. So we want the horse to understand that I'm not reinforcing you for moving that right shoulder. I'm reinforcing you for solving the problem of keep up with me while we do this thing. And I don't care how you do it. Now, I often do care. That's what this book is about, is how to design challenges so that some of the options that the horse would have used are just not good options. But that's very different from saying, here's how I want you to move. We're just taking some away, not because they're bad. In fact, like I said, if the horse moves really straight, we might want him to be crooked in a completely different way. So, yeah. I will list these books on my stories. Steering under saddle without pressure. I don't think it really matters. I mean, whatever the horse is willing to respond to in cues. I mean, my horses have autonomy even under saddle. I like that. I'm not suggesting everyone can do that or that everyone would want to do that. But having autonomy just means they have the right to say no. It doesn't mean they have the right to do whatever they want, because I have autonomy too, right? They can't drag me over here, but I'm not going to drag them over there either. So, there's no reason that you can't still do your normal rein cues with pressure if you want or not. I mean, some people will just use verbal cues or something else, or just like subtle weight shifts or something. A lot of times the rein cues will just be sort of tactile cues, but they're not really pressure. I don't personally have a problem with pressure and release if the horse isn't trying to evade that pressure and giving in to what you want because of the pressure. And that can be hard to find at first, where is that line where I'm just using it for information? Not, it's pressure, but it's pressure that's information. And I think where that line is drawn is, what do you do if the horse doesn't respond? So in this kind of a context, we would never escalate. If the horse doesn't respond, we're like, well, okay, you're saying no. I'm not going to go harder. I'm going to find out there's some reason why he's saying no. And I might never know what it is. But right now, his brain in this situation, in this exact moment, is saying, I don't think that's a good idea. And if it's a motivation thing, like he's like, oh, that's a fine idea, but I'd prefer this over here. Then that's another fun challenge for me to make that a more compelling thing. Not because of, he'll get relief, but because there's some other compelling reason. And then over time, as the horse, if you have a horse like Dramer, who has now no movement at all, like near death, and now he has an incredible movement toolkit, it means that so many movements are easy for him that even because he is such an energy saver, things are just no big deal. So it's easier for his brain to go, whatever. Okay, I'll do it. It's just easy. So that's part of the approach to motivation, is that we sneak these things under the radar. And if the horse has a big movement toolkit and he's been doing all this exploration, then we can start to ask for very specific things and raise the challenge level. Well, we always want to raise the challenge level. But, things can become more intense and more focused But again, it's something we're still not removing things from the horse's toolkit. We're just temporarily, we're going to do these things because maybe these are the ones that they want for the show, something like that. But everyone has to just make that choice. I'm not a good personal example of someone to watch. I do things that are probably crazy and dangerous. They work, but I think there are far better ways to do some of the stuff I do. I've been doing it a long time though. I think pretty much longer than just about anyone, this kind of thing. But that's why I love the Instagram community, because there's so many people doing these things, following now these same principles. A lot of them are students, some of them aren't, but they're following the same principles, and they're so creative, and they do things very differently from what I do. Things that I would say, oh, that's not going to work. And then it will work perfectly when they do it. So you should listen to everybody. Okay. How's the puppy? Huge, by the way. The puppy is now huge. He's a giant. But he's great. I'm a terrible dog trainer too, but we're just having fun. Okay. I don't see any other questions, but if you want to leave a comment on this video after it's posted, right? The chat will be there as a permanent record, but if you want to leave a normal comment to ask a question, then do that. Or, you can DM me on Instagram. I don't always see those messages, but I probably will see these on YouTube because I don't have a lot of people on YouTube. So I usually will be able to see those messages. And also, to anyone who's still here, if there are any of these topics that you would like to see me do a full live on just that one topic, this was but like those topics in the beginning, those practice topics, anything really, where I will drill down on just one thing, or anything at all. Doesn't have to be from what I talked about now. Could be motivation, any topic. I'd love to hear your ideas, because this whole live thing is only my second, brand new to me. So we'll see. All right, thank you. Thank you all so much for giving me your precious time, and possibly for some of you cutting into your sleep. And have a great rest of the week. And I'll see you maybe on Instagram, or my students, I'll see you maybe Thursday, and everybody else on my next live. Bye. Yay. Really appreciate it, you guys. It's exciting for me because I have never talked about some of those topics in the last half. So I don't know if I explained anything, but it's a really fun topic for me. Thank you, everyone. Okay, I'm signing off now. Bye.